Milan after the fall, living in a post-Roman ghost city. Stand in Milan's Piazza del Duomo today, and you're in the heart of Italy's fashion capital. The Gothic cathedral dominates the square. Designer boutiques line the Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II. 3 million people live in the metropolitan area. Milan is wealth, sophistication, and modernity. But rewind 1,400 years to the year 600 AD. And stand in this same spot, you'd see something profoundly different. No cathedral, no grand piazza, no bustling crowds. Instead, you'd see the half-collapsed ruins of what had been the Roman Imperial Palace. Its marble stripped away, its columns toppled, its halls abandoned. You'd walk through a city of perhaps 15,000 people, a fraction of its former population, living in timber huts built against crumbling Roman walls. You'd see Lombard warriors, Germanic conquerors, occupying a city they hadn't built and didn't fully understand. This is Milan in 600 AD, barely a century after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, a ghost city haunted by the ruins of Roman greatness, struggling to survive in the wreckage of civilization. To understand Milan in 600 AD, you must first understand what it had been and what it had lost. Mediolanum Roman Milan had been one of the greatest cities of the Western Roman Empire. From 286 to 402 AD, it served as the capital of the Western Empire, the residence of emperors. Diocletian, Maximian, and later emperors ruled from Milan, not Rome. The city was home to perhaps 100,000 people at its peak in the 4th century AD. It had massive city walls, an imperial palace complex, a circus for chariot races, an amphitheater, public baths, aqueducts, temples, and basilicas. But by 600 AD, that world was gone. The sequence of catastrophes that destroyed Roman Milan began in the 5th century. In 402 AD, Emperor Honorius moved the western capital from Milan to Ravenna, fearing barbarian invasions. Milan lost its imperial status. Then came waves of invasions: Visigoths, Huns under Attila who besieged the city in 452 AD, and finally the Ostrogoths who controlled Italy from the late 5th century. The death blow came during the Gothic War, 535–555 for AD, when the Byzantine Empire attempted to reconquer Italy from the Ostrogoths. Milan became a battlefield. In 539 AD, the Ostrogothic king Uriah captured Milan after a Byzantine garrison had occupied it. The Ostrogoths massacred the male population and destroyed much of the city. Archaeological evidence confirms massive destruction and depopulation during this period. By the time the Lombards, a Germanic people, invaded Italy in 568 AD and captured Milan in 569 AD, they found a city that was already a ruin. The population had collapsed from perhaps 100,000 at its Roman peak to possibly 15,000 to 20,000 people by 600 AD. The Imperial Palace was abandoned. The aqueducts were broken. The public buildings were shells. Milan in 600 AD was a post-apocalyptic landscape, a city that had witnessed the end of Roman civilization and was now occupied by Germanic conquerors trying to rebuild something from the wreckage. The Lombard occupation. In 600 AD, Milan was controlled by the Lombards, a Germanic people who had migrated from what is now Hungary and conquered most of northern and central Italy beginning in 568 AD. The Lombards were not Romans. They spoke a Germanic language. Their social structure was tribal and warrior-based, not bureaucratic and urban like the Romans. They were initially Arian Christians, though conversion to Catholicism was gradually occurring by 600 AD. The Lombard kingdom of Italy was divided into duchies, and Milan fell within the territory controlled directly by the Lombard king. In 600 AD, the Lombard king was Agilulf, who ruled from 590 to 616 AD and resided primarily in Pavia, which had become the Lombard capital, not Milan. Pavia was easier to defend and became the new center of power. Milan was governed by a Lombard duke or count appointed by the king. This official commanded the garrison of Lombard warriors, collected taxes, and administered justice according to Lombard law. Lombard law, codified in the Edictum Rothari, was based on Germanic customs: trial by combat, wergild, and personal oaths. rather than Roman legal principles. The relationship between the Lombard conquerors and the remaining Roman population was complex. The Lombards were a minority, perhaps 150,000 Lombards occupied a peninsula with several million Romanized inhabitants. They maintained military dominance, but relied on the existing Roman population for agricultural production, craft skills, and administrative knowledge. Intermarriage gradually blurred ethnic lines, though social distinctions remained for generations. The Lombards appropriated the best land and buildings for themselves. Lombard warriors occupied what remained of Roman villas. They lived as a military aristocracy, exempt from taxation, while the Roman population bore the tax burden and provided labor, urban layout, and the ruins. Milan in 600 AD was defined by what remained of its Roman past. The Roman city walls, built in the 3rd century AD, still enclosed the urban core. These walls were roughly 3.5 kilometers in circumference, enclosing about 100 hectares. The walls were constructed of brick and stone, standing perhaps 8 to 10 meters high, with towers at intervals. By 600 AD, sections of the wall had collapsed or been damaged, but the Lombards maintained and repaired key sections for defense. Gates in the walls provided access: the Porta Romana to the south, Porta Ticinese to the southwest, Porta Vercellina to the west, and others. These gates were fortified and guarded by Lombard soldiers. Inside the walls, the city was half empty. Large sections that had been densely populated in Roman times were now abandoned fields, gardens, or ruins overgrown with vegetation. The population of 15,000 to 20,000 people occupied perhaps a quarter of the available space. The former Imperial Palace complex, located in the southwestern part of the city, was in ruins. Some sections may have been occupied by Lombard nobles, but much of it was stripped for building materials. Marble panels, columns, and decorative elements were removed and reused elsewhere or burned in lime kilns to make mortar. The Roman amphitheater, which had hosted gladiatorial games, was abandoned and deteriorating. Over time, it would be completely demolished, its stones used for other construction. No medieval building would preserve its location. The circus, where chariot races had been held, was similarly abandoned. These massive structures required enormous resources to maintain, and the Lombards had neither the wealth nor the interest to preserve Roman entertainment venues. The Roman Forum, the commercial and political center, was no longer functional as a public space. The area had likely been built over or repurposed. Medieval Milan's market activities would shift to different locations. Aqueducts that had supplied Roman Milan with water were broken. The complex engineering systems had collapsed during the invasions and wars. By 600 AD, Milan's water supply came from wells, cisterns, and the small rivers that flowed through the area. The Seveso, Olona, and Lambro, along with various canals and streams. The architecture of Milan in 600 AD was a stark contrast to its Roman past. Almost all new construction was timber. The Lombards built primarily in wood, constructing timber-framed buildings. Wattle and daub walls consisted of a lattice of wooden strips covered with a mixture of clay, soil, straw, and animal dung. These structures were far less permanent than Roman brick and stone buildings. Lombard buildings were typically single-story or had one upper floor, often long rectangular halls. Families lived alongside their animals, especially in winter in the traditional Germanic longhouse style. Roofs were steeply pitched, thatched with straw or reeds, or covered with wooden shingles. These timber buildings were constructed against, and sometimes inside the ruins of Roman structures. It was common for a Lombard family to build a wooden house against the wall of a collapsed Roman building. This created a chaotic urban landscape where medieval timber construction parasitically attached itself to ancient ruins. The major exception to timber construction was churches, which were built in stone. By 600 AD, Milan had several important early Christian churches, built before or during the Lombard period. The most significant was the Basilica of Sant'Ambrogio, founded by Saint Ambrose in the 380s AD. It was built in the Roman basilica style, a rectangular hall with side aisles separated by columns, ending in an apse. The building was brick and stone with a wooden roof. It housed the tomb of Sant'Ambrogio, making it a pilgrimage site and the spiritual center of Milan. The Basilica of San Lorenzo, built in the late 4th or early 5th century, also survived. This was a large centrally planned church with a complex architectural design, incorporating Roman columns and materials. By 600 AD, it was in use but likely in need of repair after the decades of war. The baptistry, adjacent to what would later become the site of the Duomo, existed as an octagonal building where Christian baptisms were performed. These baptisteries were separate structures from churches. New Lombard churches built in the 6th and 7th centuries were simpler structures, often small single-nave halls with wooden roofs, serving local Christian communities. Reuse of Roman materials was ubiquitous. Columns, bricks, tiles, stones, and marble from collapsed Roman buildings were scavenged and incorporated into new construction. This was not preservation, it was recycling out of necessity. The population of Milan in 600 AD was stratified along ethnic and social lines. At the top were the Lombard warriors and nobles. These were the conquerors, the military elite. Lombard society was organized around the concept of the Fara clan or kinship group and the exercitus, the army. Free Lombard men were warriors by definition, expected to fight when called by the king or duke. Lombard nobles lived in the best remaining structures, wore distinctive clothing and hairstyles, and carried weapons as symbols of their status. Swords, spears, and the scramasax were common weapons. Lombard warriors wore limited armor, primarily leather or padded cloth, with metal helmets and shields. Below the Lombard elite were free Lombards of lesser status, farmers, craftsmen, and traders, who had migrated to Italy with the conquering army but did not own substantial land. The majority of the population was Roman descendants of the original inhabitants of Mediolanum. These people spoke Latin or late Latin dialects that would eventually evolve into Italian. They practiced Catholic Christianity. Unlike the initially Arian Lombards, Roman inhabitants worked as farmers, laborers, craftsmen, and servants. They paid taxes to the Lombards and were subject to Lombard law. The church hierarchy was Roman. The Bishop of Milan was an important figure, overseeing the spiritual life of the Catholic population and managing extensive church properties. The bishop often acted as an intermediary between the Lombard rulers and the Roman population. In 600 AD, the bishop resided in Milan and maintained the tradition of the Ambrosian rite. Slavery still existed, though it was declining. Slaves were typically war captives or people born into servitude. The church encouraged manumission, and Christian teachings gradually undermined the institution. Women's status depended on ethnicity and class. Lombard women had certain property rights. Roman women were subject to Roman legal traditions, which varied. Marriage was both a social contract and an economic arrangement. Women managed households, a labor-intensive role, and also worked in agriculture, textile production, and trade. Daily life in Milan in 600 AD was harsh, shaped by material scarcity, limited technology, and constant struggle. Most people woke at dawn. Candles were expensive, so activities followed daylight hours. The first task was rekindling the hearth fire, which provided heat and cooking capability. Breakfast, if eaten, was bread and perhaps cheese or leftover porridge. The main meal was at midday. For common people, the diet was monotonous: bread from barley or rye, pottage from grains and vegetables. Meat was rare for most people, perhaps salted pork or fish on special occasions. The Lombards, as a Germanic people, traditionally ate more meat than the Romanized population. Wine was common, produced in the surrounding countryside. Beer was drunk by Lombards. Water from wells and streams was consumed but was often contaminated, leading to widespread diseases. Work consumed most daylight hours. Farmers tended fields outside the city walls, growing wheat, barley, rye, vegetables, and grapes. Animal husbandry included pigs, sheep, goats, chickens, and cattle. Farmers used simple tools: wooden plows with iron tips, sickles, hoes, and axes. Craftsmen worked in small workshops. Blacksmiths forged tools, weapons, and iron fittings. Carpenters built and repaired structures. Potters made clay vessels. Leather workers produced shoes, belts, and harnesses. Textile production spinning wool. Weaving cloth was primarily women's work, done at home. Trade existed but was limited compared to Roman times. Milan was no longer a major commercial hub. Local markets sold produce, livestock, and basic goods. Long-distance trade in luxury items was for the wealthy. Sanitation was primitive. There was no functioning sewer system. The Roman sewers had collapsed or been abandoned. Human and animal waste was disposed of in pits, thrown into streets, or dumped into waterways. Disease was rampant. Plague, dysentery, typhoid, and other infectious diseases killed many, especially children. Infant mortality was extremely high, perhaps 30 to 40% before age 5. Life expectancy at birth was around 30 to 35 years, though those who survived childhood might live to 50 or 60. Hygiene was minimal. Bathing in the Roman sense, public bathhouses with heated water had disappeared. People washed hands and faces in basins, but full-body bathing was rare. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were universal. Entertainment was simple and communal. Religious festivals provided breaks from labor. Secular entertainment included storytelling, music from simple instruments like flutes or lyres, dice games, and drinking. Lombard warriors engaged in mock combat, hunting, and feasting as social activities. Religion was central to life in Milan in 600 AD. The city's religious identity was complex due to the Lombard conquest. The Lombards, invading in 568 AD, were Arian Christians. Arianism held Jesus was subordinate to God, a heresy to the Catholic Church. This created religious tension between the Lombard rulers and the Catholic Roman subjects. By 600 AD, Lombards gradually converted to Catholicism. King Agilulf's wife, Theodelinda, promoted Catholic Christianity. The conversion was uneven. Some converted quickly, others resisted, but the trend was toward Catholic orthodoxy. By the end of the 7th century, the Lombard kingdom would be officially Catholic. The Bishop of Milan was a powerful figure, leading the Catholic Church, overseeing priests, and managing properties. The bishopric owned extensive lands, generating income, making it economically powerful and spiritually influential. Churches served as community centers. Services were in Latin, not fully understood by common people. Liturgy was ritualistic, centered on Mass and sacraments. The Ambrosian rite, unique to Milan, reinforced its identity. Monasticism emerged as a major force. Monasteries, following Saint Benedict's rule, were communities of prayer, work, and study. They preserved literacy and learning, maintaining libraries and educating boys for the priesthood. Religious festivals structured the year. Christmas, Easter, and saints' feast days were celebrated. These events provided social cohesion and relief from the drudgery of daily labor. Relics were venerated. St. Ambrose's tomb in Sant'Ambrogio was a major pilgrimage site. Milan in 600 AD existed in a politically fragmented and violent world. The Western Roman Empire's collapse left no stable successor. Italy was divided. The Lombard kingdom was loosely unified. Powerful dukes operated with considerable autonomy. Internal feuds, succession disputes, and power struggles were common. Warfare was endemic. Lombard kings fought Byzantines, attempting to expand territory. Dukes fought each other. Bandits and warlords preyed on travelers and villages. Armed men were a constant presence, whether Lombard warriors, Byzantine soldiers, or local militias. Milan, diminished in importance, was less of a military target. Pavia was the real center of power, but Milan was still fortified and garrisoned, and the threat of violence was ever present. Justice was administered by Lombard law for Lombards, and a mix of laws for Romans. Legal disputes could be settled by oaths, compurgation, or trial by combat. The blood feud was a recognized feature. The law attempted to channel it into wergild payments. Punishment was physical and public. Thieves might have hands or ears cut off. Murderers could be executed or forced to pay wergild. Shaming punishments were common. The economy of Milan in 600 AD was a shadow of its Roman prosperity. Roman Mediolanum had been a center of trade, manufacturing, and imperial administration. By 600 AD, the economy had contracted dramatically, long-distance trade had collapsed, roads were in disrepair, banditry made travel dangerous, currency was scarce, barter was common, agriculture was the foundation. Most people were involved in food production. The Po River plain was fertile, but techniques were primitive. Crop yields were low, famines were periodic and devastating. Craft production existed, but was limited. Blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, weavers produced for local consumption. There was little surplus for export. Quality and standardization had declined. Taxation was how the Lombard elite extracted wealth from the Roman population. Taxes were paid in kind or labor. The burden was heavy, supporting warriors and the royal court. The church was a major economic actor. Monasteries and bishoprics owned extensive lands. They collected tithes and employed laborers, often better managed and more stable. Milan in 600 AD was a broken city, a ghost of its Roman grandeur. The imperial capital was reduced to a timber settlement, its population decimated, infrastructure collapsed. Its economy reduced to subsistence agriculture. Yet, this devastation was not the end of Milan's story. Over the following centuries, the city would slowly recover. Lombards would convert to Catholicism, integrating with the Roman population, creating a hybrid Italo-Lombard culture. Charlemagne would conquer the Lombard kingdom, incorporating northern Italy into the Carolingian Empire. By 1000 AD, Milan would be growing again. By 1100 AD, leading city of Italian communes. By 1300 AD, it would be a powerful city-state. But in 600 AD, none of that was certain. Milan was simply trying to survive, its people scavenging stone from temples to build hovels, drinking from wells because aqueducts were broken, ruled by Germanic warriors who couldn't read Latin inscriptions on crumbling monuments. That Milan post-Roman, post-apocalyptic, haunted by ghosts, was the low point in the city's history. But it was also the seed from which the medieval and modern city would eventually grow. The ruins became foundations, the survivors became ancestors, and the ghost city, slowly, painfully, came back to life.